The Great Flood explained. Divine punishment or a reset to bury ancient horrors? We are told the story in 100 different cultures, 100 different languages. A story of a world grown wicked and corrupt. A story of a righteous God or gods, who, in their anger, decide to wash the slate clean, to drown the world in a great, all-consuming deluge, saving only a single worthy family to begin the world anew. It is a tale of divine judgment, of sin and retribution, a powerful and enduring cautionary tale. But what if this story, in all its forms, is a simplification? A comforting, moralistic explanation for an event whose true cause was far more terrifying and far more alien? What if the wickedness of mankind was not the cause of the flood, but merely a symptom of a much deeper, more ancient sickness? What if the flood was not sent to destroy a sinful humanity, but to bury the pre-human horrors that were beginning to reawaken and infect them? Today, we journey back to the antediluvian world, the world before the great rain. We will uncover a story not of divine anger, but of divine desperation. A story of ancient, buried things, of a psychic contagion, and of a God who had to drown the world, not to punish his children, but to save them from a madness that was not their own. Welcome to Mythos Unveiled. Today, we seek to explain the Great Flood, not as a punishment for our sins, but as a great, cosmic reset, a desperate gambit to rebury the ancient and terrible horrors of the past. To understand the necessity of the Great Flood, we must first understand the world that came before it. We must part the mists of time and look upon the antediluvian age, the world of the first men. In the sacred texts of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it was the time of the descendants of Cain, a world that grew loud with violence and sin after the first murder had stained the new earth. In the even older Sumerian and Babylonian myths, it was a golden age that slowly tarnished, an age where humanity, created as servants of the gods, had grown too numerous, their constant noise and activity disturbing the peace of the divine rulers. In almost every ancient culture, from the Greeks to the Hindus, there is a memory, a folktale, a whisper of a time before a great world-altering deluge. And almost all of these stories describe that time as an age of profound corruption, a time when humanity, for one reason or another, had lost its way. But what if this corruption, this wickedness, this noise, was not a simple moral failing? What if it was a sickness, a psychic plague, whose source was not in the burgeoning pride and jealousy of the hearts of men, but in the very earth beneath their feet, in the ancient, sleeping memory of the world itself? Let us imagine the world as it was then. In the long, forgotten eons before the creation of man, the earth was not empty. It was not a pristine, untouched paradise. It was a battleground, and more than that, it was a prison. As we have unveiled in our previous chronicles, the gods of order, whether they be the Olympians of the Greeks, the Elohim of the Hebrews, or the Anunnaki of the Sumerians, built their new, ordered world on top of the ruins and the graves of older, more chaotic and more terrifying powers. They had buried their monstrous predecessors deep, sealing them with magic and with mountains, with divine laws and with sacred geometries, and they had hoped, with all their divine might, that these ancient things would sleep forever. The telluric heart, the living, dreaming core of a continent, was sunk beneath an ocean to become the foundation of Atlantis's watery tomb. The firstborn fears, the chaotic, paradoxical first thoughts of the Creator, were sealed in the conceptual prison of the silent abyss. And countless other entities, beings whose very names have been erased from history, were chained in the darkness, buried in the deep places of the earth. The earth, then, is a layered prison, and for a time the prison held. But nothing, not even a prison built by the gods, sleeps forever. In the antediluvian age, for reasons we may never fully know, perhaps a shifting of the cosmic alignments, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, or perhaps simply the inexorable, patient passage of uncounted millennia. The ancient seals began to weaken. The divine wards began to fray. And the buried things, the ancient horrors, began to stir in their long slumber. They did not awaken fully. That would have been an instant and obvious cataclysm. No, their stirring was far more subtle and far more insidious. In their deep cosmic slumber, they began to dream. And their dreams, like the telepathic emanations of the sleeping Cthulhu, began to leak up from the depths of the earth. They were a psychic poison, a spiritual contagion, seeping into the consciousness of the new, young, and psychically sensitive race of humanity that now walked the earth above their tombs. This was the true source of the wickedness of the antediluvian world. It was not a simple human choice to do evil. It was a creeping psychic infection. Men and women began to have nightmares, not of simple fears like predators or storms, but of impossible, non-human shapes, of maddening geometries, of dark, liquid things that moved without form. They began to hear whispers on the wind that were not their own thoughts, insidious suggestions that spoke of power, of dominance, of a glorious chaos that their own ordered, agrarian lives lacked. Their minds were being slowly, subtly warped by the dreaming of the buried, alien gods. The corruption was a symptom of this psychic plague. Their societies, once simple and based on community and survival, became consumed with a new, feverish and unnatural desire for power, for conquest, for the building of great, arrogant towers that sought to pierce the heavens, like the Tower of Babel, not just out of human pride, but out of a subconscious, desperate desire to escape the maddening whispers that were rising from the earth below. The violence that filled the earth, as the book of Genesis so starkly describes it, was not just the violence of men against men over land or resources. It was a new, more profound, and more senseless violence. It was the violence of men whose minds were being filled with the chaotic, predatory, and immoral thoughts of the slumbering horrors below. They were becoming less human, more like the monstrous, pre-human things that were dreaming them into a new, terrible, and more useful form. The most famous and most misunderstood story of this period is that of the Nephilim from the ancient Hebrew texts. The book of Genesis tells us that the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, looked down upon the daughters of men, saw that they were beautiful, and took them as their wives. And from their union, a race of giants, the Nephilim, were born. The mighty men who were of old, men of renown. This is often interpreted as a story of angelic sin, of fallen angels breaking their divine vows and succumbing to mortal lust. But what if it was something else entirely? What if these sons of God were not angels at all in the way we understand them? What if they were the first, most powerful human psychics, men whose minds were more open, more sensitive to the whispers from the deep? Men who, instead of going mad, learned to channel the power of the dreaming entities, becoming demigods in their own right, beings of immense power and terrible inhuman appetites. And what if their union with the daughters of men was not a marriage of love or lust, but an act of deliberate psychic infection? What if they were not breeding with women, but infecting them with this psychic plague, altering their very genetic and spiritual code to create a new race of beings, a new species, the Nephilim? These were not just giants. They were half human, half monster, the first true avatars of the awakening horrors, a bridge between the world of men and the world of the dreaming things below. They were beautiful, they were powerful, and they were a sign that the psychic plague was now capable of creating its own physical soldiers. The world was growing sick. Humanity was being corrupted, not by its own choices, but by a psychic contagion from a forgotten age. The very planet was becoming a breeding ground for a new era of monsters, a world that was slowly, inexorably, being terraformed back into the chaotic image of the things that had once ruled it. The experiment of humanity was failing, not because of a flaw in its design, but because the foundation upon which it had been built was poisoned. The gods, the great creators and guardians of humanity, watched from their celestial thrones, and they were filled with a growing, terrible dread. They were not distant, uncaring landlords, observing their tenants from afar. They were the architects of this world, the shepherds of this new, fragile race of beings. And they saw what was happening. With their divine perception, a perception that sees not just the physical world but the spiritual and psychic energies that underpin it, they could feel the change in the very fabric of their creation. They recognized the ancient, familiar, and terrifying stench of the old powers, the ones they had fought so hard to defeat, to dismember, and to bury at the very dawn of their own age. In the Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic, the great god Enlil, the god of wind, air, and storm, is driven to despair by the noise of humanity. The story, in its simplest form, tells us he could not sleep because of their clamor, their endless chattering and activity. But what if this noise was not the sound of laughter and talking, of the forging of tools and the building of cities? What if it was a psychic noise? The chaotic, dissonant, and maddening frequency of millions of corrupted minds. A psychic scream so loud that it was beginning to disrupt the harmony of the cosmos itself. It was a spiritual static that was interfering with the very function of the divine order. A constant, irritating, and dangerous hum of madness that was growing louder with every generation. In the book of Genesis, God looks upon the earth from his heavenly court and sees that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This was not the simple moral condemnation of a flawed and sinful creation. This was a divine diagnosis, a clinical, sorrowful, and terrifying assessment of a terminal, spiritual, and psychic illness that had no known cure. The Creator was seeing not just a flawed people, but a corrupted and infected species, a species that was now acting as a host for a far older and more dangerous disease. A great, divine council was held. The gods of order, whatever their names in the tongues of Mont Olympians, gathering in the great hall on their cloudy mountain. The council of Yahweh in the highest seventh heaven. The Anunnaki in their celestial court among the stars debated what was to be done. Some, the more wrathful and pragmatic among them, like the Sumerian Enlil, argued for a simple, total, and final annihilation. The human experiment had failed. It was corrupted beyond repair, a failed project that now threatened the stability of the entire system. They must be wiped out, erased from existence, and perhaps, after a long age of healing, a new, more resilient race could be created in their place. But others, the more compassionate or perhaps more scientifically minded among the gods, argued for a different path. A path of preservation, however narrow and however difficult. In the Hebrew tradition, God sees the overwhelming corruption, but his all-seeing gaze also falls upon a single, uninfected man, Noah. A man described as just and perfect in his generations. A man who walked with God. In the Mesopotamian myths, it is the great god Enki or Ea, the god of wisdom, of water, and of creation, who argues against Enlil's plan for total destruction. He, in his wisdom, sees that the problem is not humanity itself, which was, after all, their creation. He sees that the problem is the terrible, ancient, and alien sickness that has infected it. They realized, in their divine wisdom, that they could not fight this sickness directly. To wage another direct war against the buried things, to try and kill the great sleeping horrors in their subterranean and submarine tombs, would be to risk shattering the planet. It would be like trying to perform surgery on a patient's heart with a sledgehammer. To attack the buried ones directly would be to risk breaking the very seals that held them, and to risk a full and catastrophic awakening, which would be an even greater and more final catastrophe than the one they were currently facing. They also realized that they could not cure the infected. The psychic plague was not a physical ailment to be healed with divine medicine. It had become a part of the human soul, woven into the very fabric of their thoughts and their desires. It had become their new nature. To try and cure them would be to unmake their very identities, to leave them as empty, mindless shells. They were left with only one terrible and drastic solution. A solution that was not an act of punishment, but an act of cosmic environmental medicine. An act of profound and terrible divine surgery. They needed to perform a global reset. They needed to cleanse the surface of the planet, to wash away the corrupted civilizations, the monstrous, half-human Nephilim, and the psychic taint that had seeped into the very soil of the earth. And more importantly, they needed to add weight. They needed to bury the sleeping horrors even deeper, under a new, immensely heavy, and permanent layer of water and silt. They needed to reinforce their ancient prisons and hopefully, by increasing the pressure and lowering the temperature of the deep places, to muffle their dreaming minds for another few eons, to push them back into a deeper, more profound slumber. They decided to bring forth a great world-covering flood. It was not a decision made in anger, though anger at the state of their corrupted creation was certainly present. It was a decision made in sorrow, in desperation, and in a kind of grim cosmic necessity. It was the decision of a physician who, seeing that a body is riddled with an incurable cancerous disease that is about to consume it entirely, must choose to amputate the limb to save the life. And humanity, in its current corrupted state, was that limb. But they would not destroy everything. They would save a seed. They chose a single, uncorrupted family, Noah's in the Hebrew tradition, Utnapishtim's in the Babylonian, Ziusadra's in the Sumerian, to be the vessel for the future of a cleansed and hopefully healthier humanity. This family was not chosen simply because they were good in a moral sense, though that was certainly a part of it. They were chosen because they were clean. Their minds, their bloodline, their very spirits had somehow remained untainted, or at least resistant to the psychic whispers from the deep. They were the last, best hope for their species, the last uncorrupted data in a hopelessly corrupted system. And so, the chosen man, Noah, was given a secret, divine instruction. He was visited by God, who spoke to him not of the wickedness of his neighbors, but of the coming of a great, cleansing water. He was not just told to build an ark to save his family and the animals from a great flood. He was being made a co-conspirator. He was being given a sacred, terrible, and vital role in the great and necessary act of planetary sanitation. He was to become the curator of a new, clean world, the guardian of the seed of life, while the old, sick world was washed away forever. Let us focus now on the most famous of these chosen figures, the man known to the Hebrew tradition as Noah. He was a man who lived in a world that was rapidly and terrifyingly going mad. He would have seen the signs of the psychic plague everywhere. He would have seen the strange, unsettling, and non-human patterns appearing in the art and architecture of his neighbors, their buildings twisting into strange, unsettling angles, their pottery decorated with monstrous, dreamlike shapes. He would have heard the violent, paranoid, and increasingly chaotic whispers in the marketplaces, where men who were once friends now looked at each other with suspicion and hatred. He would have seen the great, monstrous Nephilim, the giant, half-human beings, walking the earth, their eyes burning with a cold, alien light, a physical testament to the world's growing and horrifying corruption. And in this world of encroaching chaos, a world that had forgotten its creator, he alone remained tethered to the old ways, to the principles of order, of peace, and of divine law. One day, as the corruption of the world reached its peak, God spoke to him. It was not a voice of thunder and fury. It was a voice of deep, cosmic sorrow and grim, unavoidable necessity. He was told that a great flood was coming, a flood that would destroy all life on earth, a great, cleansing water to wash away the sickness. And he was given a set of precise, divine, and architectural instructions, a blueprint for salvation. He was to build an ark of gopher wood, a strong and resinous wood known for its durability. It was to be a vessel of immense, almost unbelievable size, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. It was to have 3 decks, filled with many rooms and stalls, and a single window, a zohar, near the top, a source of light in the coming darkness. And he was to seal it, inside and out, with pitch, a black, sticky substance that would make it impervious to the coming, all-consuming waters. He was to bring his wife, his 3 sons Shem, Ham, and Japhethan their wives into the safety of the ark. And he was to gather 2 of every kind of living creature, male and female, every bird, every beast, every creeping thing, to preserve the sacred seed of life on earth. This was a monumental, and in the eyes of his contemporaries, a completely insane task. Noah and his family, upon receiving this divine command, began their great work. They became objects of ridicule and scorn in their community, as they felled the great gopher trees and began to plane the wood, building this enormous, landlocked vessel far from any sea. Their neighbors, their minds already touched by the psychic plague of arrogance and madness, would have laughed at them. They would have gathered to mock the old man and his sons, toiling away under the sun on their foolish project. "Look at the old man Noah," they would have jeered, their laughter sharp and cruel. "The sun has baked his brain. He builds a great ship on a dry mountain. Has he grown gills, that he plans to sail on the dust?" But Noah and his family persevered. Their faith in the divine warning was absolute. They did not argue. They did not try to convince their mocking neighbors. They simply worked. For 120 years, the story says, a period of divine patience as God gave the world a final chance to repent. A chance that was never taken, the work continued. The great ark slowly, painstakingly, took shape, a lonely, colossal monument of sanity and faith in a world that was slowly, but surely losing its mind. It was an act of pure, unwavering obedience in a world that had forgotten the very meaning of the word. And as the ark neared completion, a great and final miracle began to unfold. The animals came. This was not a process of Noah and his sons hunting them down, trapping them, and forcing them into the ark. This was a divine intervention, an act of cosmic preservation. The uncorrupted animals of the world, guided by a deep, instinctual, and supernatural understanding of the coming catastrophe, came to him. From the deserts of the south came the lions, their manes like the sun, walking calmly, 2 by 2. From the mountains of the north came the great bears, their fur thick against the cold. From the jungles of the far east came the elephants and the apes. The birds of the air, from the smallest, iridescent hummingbird to the greatest, soaring eagle, flew in great, orderly flocks and entered the ark. The creeping things of the earth, the lizards and the insects, came in their own turn. 2 by 2, they entered the great vessel, finding their designated places in the floating sanctuary that had been prepared for them, their simple, animal minds untroubled by the psychic plague that had so thoroughly corrupted the minds of humanity. Finally, the great work was done. The ark was finished. The massive stores of provisions were loaded. Noah, his family, and the great, peaceful menagerie of the world's untainted life were safely inside. And then, as God had commanded, Noah, with the help of his sons, sealed the great single door of the ark from within. They were now cut off from the world, floating in a wooden bubble of hope, waiting in the dim, lantern-lit, and animal-scented silence for the end of their world to begin. And then the rain came, but this was not a normal rain. The biblical text is very specific and very strange, and its words hold the key to the true, terrible nature of the event. It says that on the 17th day of the second month, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. This was not just a great storm. This was a deliberate two-pronged act of cosmic decreation and recreation. The windows of heaven, or the floodgates of the sky, opening was not just rain as we know it. It was the celestial ocean, the waters above the firmament as described in the first chapter of Genesis, the great primordial waters that were separated from the waters below at the very moment of creation, being allowed to pour down upon the earth once more. And the fountains of the great deep breaking up was even more significant. This was the subterranean water, the water from the heart of the earth itself, the great ancient aquifers bursting forth. The gods were not just flooding the world from above. They were breaking it open from below. They were causing the very crust of the earth to shift, to collapse in on itself, allowing the ancient primordial subterranean waters to rise and cover everything. The purpose was not just to drown the surface, but to fundamentally and permanently change the geology of the planet, to add an immense, unimaginable, and permanent weight of water to the world, to increase the pressure on the deep places, to reinforce the ancient, failing prisons of the sleeping horrors. For 40 days and 40 nights the waters rose. The laughter of Noah's neighbors turned to screams of terror as the floodwaters, coming from both above and below, swept through their cities, toppling their arrogant towers, washing away all traces of their corrupted, plague-ridden civilization. The great, monstrous Nephilim themselves, for all their strength, were helpless against the rising, world-consuming tide. The earth was being scrubbed clean, its psychic and physical sickness being drowned in a great, purifying, and terrible deluge. It was the end of an age, and for the chosen few, safe inside their floating sanctuary, it was the beginning of a new, clean, and silent world. The ark, a solitary vessel in a world unmade, a single wooden world guided by a divine and unseen hand, floated safely upon the surface of this new, global ocean. Inside, in the dim, lantern-lit, and swaying confines of their wooden sanctuary, Noah and his family could only listen. They listened to the muffled, terrifying sounds of a dying world. They heard the ceaseless, drumming roar of the rain from the heavens and the deep, groaning rumble of the earth as the fountains of the great deep continued to disgorge their ancient, primordial waters. They heard the distant, final screams of their neighbors, of their cities, of their entire civilization, as it was washed away. And then, after 40 days and 40 nights, they heard a new sound. Silence. A silence more profound, more absolute, and more terrifying than the storm that had preceded it. It was the silence of a world wiped clean, a world returned to its primordial, watery beginnings. The psychic noise of the dreaming, buried things, the constant, maddening whispers that had driven their age to madness, had been muffled, pushed back down into a deep, watery slumber by the immense, crushing pressure of the new ocean. The constant spiritual static that had infected the very air they breathed was gone. For the first time in centuries, the world was at peace, a quiet, empty, and solemn peace. For 150 days, the ark drifted on this silent, empty sea. It was a world without landmarks, a world without shores. Only the sky above and the water below. It was a time of waiting, of reflection, a time for the earth to heal from its psychic wounds. Noah and his family tended to the animals, their daily tasks a small, comforting ritual of order in the midst of an unmade world. They were the keepers of a floating zoo, the curators of a new creation. Finally, after the long months of drifting, God remembered Noah, and a wind passed over the earth, and the waters began to recede. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were closed. The great, cosmic reset was complete, and the ark, after its long and lonely voyage, came to rest. It did not drift ashore on a sandy beach. It came to rest on the high, lonely peaks of the mountains of Ararat. Still, they waited. The world outside was a mystery, a new and untested creation. After 40 days, Noah opened the single window of the ark and sent out a raven, a strong and hardy bird. The raven, the story tells us, flew back and forth, finding no place to rest, for the waters still covered the earth. Then he sent out a dove, a bird of peace and of new beginnings. The dove, unable to find a single branch to perch upon, returned to the ark, for she too could find no dry land. He waited another 7 days, a period of sacred patience, and sent the dove out again. This time, she returned in the evening, and in her beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. It was a sign that the waters had receded enough for the trees, the symbols of life, to begin to grow again. A sign that the world was no longer a watery grave, but a place of new and clean life. He waited another 7 days and sent the dove out once more. This time she did not return. She had found a place to make her home. The world was ready, and on the 27th day of the second month, when Noah was 601 years old, the earth was finally completely dry. And God spoke to Noah, his voice not a command of judgment, but a gentle instruction for a new beginning. Go forth from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and their wives with you. Bring forth with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. And so the great pitch-sealed door of the ark was unsealed, and Noah, his family, and all the animals emerged from their long, dark confinement into a clean, empty, and silent world. The air was fresh, the sky was clear, and the psychic sickness that had plagued the old world was gone. The first thing Noah did, as a man of faith, was build an altar. He took one of every clean animal and every clean bird, and he offered a burnt offering to God, an offering of profound thanks for their salvation, for their preservation, for the chance to begin again. And God, pleased with this act of piety, smelled the pleasing aroma, and he made a covenant, a sacred and unbreakable promise, not just to Noah, but to all of creation, to all future generations. He set a great, beautiful, and ethereal rainbow in the clouds, and he said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." This is the beautiful, hopeful story we are told. A story of a promise, of a new beginning, of a God who has reconciled with his creation. But this promise, in our unveiled understanding, has a deeper, more chilling, and more pragmatic meaning. It was not just a promise to humanity. It was a promise and perhaps a warning from the gods to themselves. A promise that this drastic, desperate, and world-altering act of planetary sanitation would never have to be performed again. It was an expression of hope that the new, heavier blanket of water upon the earth, the new, deeper oceans, would be enough to keep the ancient horrors sleeping, to keep their dreams from ever again infecting the minds of men. The rainbow was not just a symbol of hope. It was a symbol of a successful, if terrible and costly, quarantine. The world had been saved, but the memory of the sickness and the memory of the terrible cure would forever be a part of its story. The Great Flood was not the end of the story of the ancient horrors. It was merely the end of a chapter, and the new world, a world born from a global deluge, would now begin, its own history forever shaped by the echoes of a flood that was not a punishment, but a desperate and necessary cosmic reset. The greatest disasters in our myths are not always punishments for our own sins. Sometimes they are the echoes of a much older, much deeper conflict. And sometimes a great flood is not sent to drown the wicked, but to silence the terrible, dreaming whispers of the ancient, buried dead. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the antediluvian world. If this unveiling of a universal myth has washed away your old assumptions, show your support by liking this video, subscribing to Mythos Unveiled, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the heart of our most profound and secret legends. What other great, world-altering myth do you believe holds a deeper, more hidden purpose? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, look to the rainbow, and remember that its beauty may be the seal upon a very old and very terrible secret.